the recording. All right, so we're going to start off today talking about the classical symphony and the concerto and chamber music. And these are, you've heard me use the phrase types of composition in our listening assignments, and there was still a little bit of confusion, I think, about those. So when I talk about the types of composition, these are what I'm referring to. So each genre or each era is going to have a different some different types of composition that are popular. And the official word, the technical word for this is genre. But I avoid using that term because we don't use that term correctly in the 21st century. We think of genre as like rock and roll, hip hop, country, that kind of stuff. But genre technically is actually like what the ensemble, like what it's written for, the type of composition. Is it a symphony? Is it a string quartet? Is it a concerto? That's technically what genre means. But so if I ask about a type of composition, this is what I'm asking for. And in the classical era, we get a new type of composition that becomes very popular and is going to remain popular throughout the rest of music history, and that is the classical symphony. So the symphony, the short answer, there's a question on your multiple choice assignments and a question on the exam that just asks, what is a symphony? And the short answer for that is that a symphony is a sonata for orchestra, which basically just means it's a standalone piece to show off the orchestra and to feature the entire orchestra as a whole, as opposed to a solo instrument of some kind. It's really meant to feature the entire orchestra. And this evolved out of the idea of like the overture we talked about in opera, that was the instrumental work that would introduce an opera. People decided that they really liked those and they were very popular to be played by instrumental ensembles. And eventually that evolved into what we now know as the symphony. And the symphony is usually, starting in the classical era, became a composer's kind of big opus, their big work to really show that they have the composition skills to create a large, ambitious, extended work for instrumental ensemble for the orchestra. So these are larger works, multi-movement works, anywhere between 20 and 45-minute long in the classical era. In the early classical era, they tended to be shorter. Joseph Haydn, who we're going to talk about today, wrote 104 symphonies, and most of them were fairly short, anywhere between 15 and 20 minutes long. Mozart's symphonies tended to be about 20 to 30 minutes long, but then we get to Beethoven, and they start getting much longer, 30 to 45 minutes and up to an hour long. And then we get into the Romantic era in a couple of weeks, and we'll see that the symphonies get much larger. So we're talking about an hour to an hour and a half to 2 hours long for these major symphonic works. Okay, but they still hold a similar form. There are some exceptions to this, but in the classical era, the symphony is almost always 4 movements, and it always follows this same form, this same pattern. Okay, whereas the concerto grosso that we talked about in the Baroque era always followed that fast, slow, fast form for the movements. The symphony does that as well, but we insert a third movement that's based on the minuet, or a dance of some kind, and most often it's a minuet. So the first movement is going to be a faster movement, usually an allegro or something like that, and it's generally going to be in sonata form. Most often the first movement's in sonata form. The second movement's going to be a slower movement for contrast, sometimes in sonata form, sometimes it'll be in a theme and variation form. Some of the most popular symphonies use a theme and variation for the second movement. The third movement is almost always going to be in triple meter, and it's going to be a dance of some kind, either a minuet or a scherzo for Beethoven, but most of the earlier classical composers used the minuet and trio form that we talked about the other day. And then the fourth movement was most often a rondo or a sonata form and would return back to the fast pace of the first movement, sometimes even faster, to really be kind of the grand finale of the symphony. Okay, generally the movements of these symphonies are standalone. You can actually listen to just a single movement from a symphony and it sounds fine by itself. But when you put them all together, we get the entire work. And you can think of that kind of like a modern album. Most of the time today, because of the way that we stream music and listen to music, we don't often listen to an entire album from an artist at a time. That's kind of a tradition that's gone away when we listen to music for the most part. And the symphony is kind of the same way. It's like an album by that composer. You've got 4 different pieces, which you can think of as 4 different songs or tracks to this larger album. And you can listen to them on their own, or you can put them all together and listen to them as a whole. Now, if an orchestra is going to play a symphony, they'll typically play the whole thing. They'll play all of the movements. But you do occasionally see, especially for Pops concerts, you'll see them take particular movements, some of the more popular movements from certain symphonies, and do them by themselves. And a lot of times when you look them up on YouTube, they're split into separate videos. So you have each movement has its own video, although sometimes you see a full video that's the entire symphony and you have to kind of click through it to get to the different movements. Okay, so that's the classical symphony. Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, all of those guys wrote symphonies. Haydn is considered to be the father of the symphony. He really perfected the genre and really is the one that solidified this form and made it such a popular form for instrumentalists to use in the classical era. Of course, he taught both Mozart and Beethoven, so they were very interested in writing symphonies as well. And from there, every other major composer is going to compose a few symphonies at least. The later classical and romantic composers did not compose as many of them. As I said, Haydn wrote about 104, Mozart wrote almost 50, but then Beethoven wrote 9 symphonies. And almost all of the composers in the Romantic era that we're going to study wrote, anywhere between 5 and 10 symphonies. We don't really have another composer that writes over 100 like Haydn did. And that's partially because the symphonies get much larger. By the time we get to the end of the classical era, there's a lot more instruments, which takes a lot longer to write, and they become longer, bigger, more ambitious pieces of music. So a composer's not going to write as many of them in their lifetime as somebody like Haydn did. Another slightly related genre to come out of the classical era is the concerto. Now, we had in the Baroque era the concerto grosso, which was designed to feature a group of artists. The concerto is designed to feature a single artist, a solo instrument, with the orchestra as the backup. And like a symphony, it's multi-movement. It's going to be a big, long piece of music, 20 to 45 minutes long in the classical era. And usually it's going to have 3 movements, and it's going to follow that concerto grosso, fast, slow, fast idea. The piano was the most popular solo instrument of the classical era for these concertos. We have a lot of piano concertos where you have a feature pianist with the orchestra playing behind him. That was really popular in the classical era. We're going to listen to a concerto today from Haydn that's actually a trumpet concerto, and we'll talk about where that came from. But most often composers in the classical era were writing piano concertos, although we do have a few other feature ones. In the Romantic era, we do start to see more other feature instruments showing up, and there are a lot of really great concertos for pretty much all of the instruments that are popular today. We even see modern orchestras performing new concertos that are written for more modern instruments. The prog rock guitarist Yngwie Malmsteen wrote an electric guitar concerto that's been performed that's really great. The jazz banjo player Bela Fleck wrote a banjo concerto that the Nashville Orchestra premiered a few years ago that's really cool. So we're starting to see some other concertos starting to come around as well in modern times. I think that's really neat to see some of that stuff. Okay, so this gives the composer a chance to feature a solo instrument and a lot of times to feature a specific performer. If you look at the concertos that were written in the classical era, most of the time they were written for a specific person, and we can actually look up that information and see who it was written for. So the composer was really trying to show off the virtuosity of that individual person. Of course, nowadays, obviously, they're performed by anybody that is capable of performing them. But if you look at the techniques that are used in these classical concertos, you can oftentimes tie them to somebody who was particularly good at their instrument and wanted to show off a particular technique. And at the end of the first movement and sometimes the last movement, that's when you really give the soloist a time to shine. The orchestra will stop completely, and the soloist will perform what's called a cadenza, which is an extended solo where they really get to perform by themselves. And in the classical era, most of the time this was improvised. It was kind of like the big guitar solo of a rock and roll piece. Where the soloist would really get a chance to just go nuts. And sometimes they would use some of the main themes of the concerto and kind of play with them, but they would really show off their technique there. They're all over the piano, all up and down the piano, playing really fast, crazy stuff and building up a lot of tension. And then they'd hit a couple of big chords and the whole orchestra would come back in to finish it up. In the classical era, as I said, those were often improvised, but later on in the Romantic era, we're going to start to see them written out as well, which is really fun for modern day instrumentalists to try to learn these cadenzas that some of these absolutely insane pianists wrote out for their concertos. Rachmaninoff is one that his are kind of insane. Franz Schubert's are crazy because he was such a great pianist. Franz Liszt's piano concertos are nearly impossible for anybody that's not 6.5 feet tall because he had very long fingers and could do some stretches on the piano that most people can't do today. But I digress. And then also in the classical era, we have what is called chamber music. And chamber music basically means any music that is written for a smaller ensemble. So in the classical era, this was music that was not designed for a large concert hall. It was designed for a smaller parlor or a smaller chamber. So after dinner music that would be performed in a garden or something like that. Or even sometimes you would just have a small party where you would gather up a small ensemble and just listen to the music. They would put on a concert. And there's all kinds of, obviously there's kind of an unlimited combination of instruments you can use here for these chamber ensembles. But we do have some that are very popular in the classical era, and the most important of those is the string quartet. This is when the string quartet really began to thrive in the classical era. The string quartet is a small ensemble. It's a quartet, obviously made of 4 people. So there's 2 violins, first and second violin, a viola, and a cello. And again, the string quartet is kind of a standard form for composers to write for. As you're studying music in college, if you're going to be a composition major, you're probably going to write a string quartet. Most colleges and most composition teachers expect their students to learn how to write string quartets. There are still composers today writing some really fantastic string quartets. But Beethoven's string quartets are especially notable. They are considered some of the greatest music ever written by composers and musicologists. Some really wonderful stuff in Beethoven's string quartets, especially his later ones. The string quartet typically follows the same form as the symphony. It's a 4-movement form, and it usually follows that fast, slow, dance, fast form that the symphony followed, and usually using the same forms, the sonata and the theme and variations, rondos, and the minuets in there, most often. And we'll listen to some string quartets a little bit later. We've already listened to some. When we talked about rondo form, we listened to a Beethoven string quartet, and some really beautiful music. If you want just some light music to listen to while you're studying, string quartet music is often really fantastic. One of my favorite composers, a composer named Philip Glass, who's a 21st century composer. He wrote a lot of film music. He's written some modern films. But his most popular film, I think, that he wrote was The Truman Show back in the late 90s. But he's a really, really great composer, and his string quartets are just mesmerizing. The Kronos Quartet is a pretty famous modern string quartet that that has played a bunch of Philip Glass's music, and they have an album of Philip Glass string quartets that is some of my favorite classical music ever written. Really beautiful stuff. Some other popular settings of chamber music in the classical era include the sonata for violin and piano. So this is another kind of feature tune that's going to feature the violin with a piano accompaniment, but instead of being a concerto, it's going to be called a sonata. Also the piano trio, which has a violin, a cello, and the piano. And then sometimes the string quintet, which is like a string quartet, but with a second viola, so a slightly larger ensemble. These days, chamber music can be anything. We have woodwind quintets that are really popular, saxophone ensembles, brass quintets and quartets, all kinds of really great chamber music ensembles out there, even like guitar trios and stuff like that are a lot of fun to listen to. So if you're ever looking at like the UCA music department events page, and you see chamber music ensembles, that's just basically means it's going to be smaller ensembles performing that day. Okay, and that brings us to our first big composer. So in the classical era, composition becomes hugely popular, and we have hundreds of composers from the classical era that we could talk about. But really, there are three major composers that kind of set the standard for everybody else. And that's Joseph Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven. Names that you've heard before, hugely recognized composers. And most of the other composers of the classical era were composing in the same style as those guys. Early in the classical era, everybody wanted to compose like Haydn because he was the man. He was the most famous of his day, of his time in the early classical era, and was a fantastic teacher. And people were studying his music and learning directly from him how to compose. Later on, people started following Mozart's ideas, and then later on, Beethoven really changed the world. And by the Romantic era, everybody wanted to compose like Beethoven. And why not? So one of the big differences between the classical era and the Romantic era is that when we get to the Romantic era, you'll notice that there's like 15 composers that we're going to talk about. And that's because in the Romantic era, most composers wanted to have their individual style, their own style of writing. Whereas in the classical era, pretty much everybody was composing like these three big composers were. And even Mozart and Beethoven started off composing in the style of Haydn and then went and did their own thing from there. So Joseph Haydn is an Austrian-born composer, born in 1732 to just a middle-class family in Austria, and he grew up listening to folk music and dancing, and he was recognized as having a really great voice early on. So he was sent to Vienna to study at St. Charles, I think, as a choir boy. But when his voice changed as a teenager, he was dismissed. He lost the kind of voice soprano sound that he had, and he was dismissed from the school at that point. And unfortunately, that kind of left him penniless. He didn't really have any prospects from there. So he just started teaching some music lessons to younger students, and also playing violin in these Viennese street ensembles. So he continued to study, he continued to work freelance in Vienna, and eventually some patrons, some wealthy people, discovered that he was a really talented guy and started promoting his music and promoting him and supporting him. And eventually, by the time he was 30, he was sent to work at the Esterhazy, with the Esterhazy family as a court composer. Haydn is really one of the last great court composers. And the Esterhazy family was this super wealthy Hungarian family at the time, and they absolutely loved music. They were huge patrons of music, and were really grateful to have a great composer there. And Haydn spent the next 30 years of his life there with the Esterhazy family, and most of the time in their main palace, which had like an opera house and a major concert hall and a couple of smaller recital halls. It was a huge estate. So he spent his life with the Esterhazys, we mentioned this before, where he was technically a servant, but he was highly recognized and highly respected from the Esterhazy family. So he had a pretty good life. Even though he was a servant. And he became especially close to one of the princes, Nicholas, who was a huge patron of music and had him write thousands and thousands of pieces of music for him, including some on this really outdated instrument called the baritone, which is not related to the modern baritone, the brass instrument. It was kind of a weird hybrid of like a cello and a lute that apparently Nicholas Esterhazy was a really big fan of. But Haydn, while he was there, was also really perfecting his skills in writing string quartets and writing symphonies and writing opera and some of that other stuff. But after, well, we should say that while he was working for the Esterházys, he made a couple of trips to London in the 1790s, and it was there that he wrote his London symphonies, which are some of the greatest symphonies ever written, including the 104th Symphony that we listened to last week as a daily listening assignment. So his London symphonies were highly recognized, and by the time he left the Esterházy family after Prince Nicholas died, he was a major celebrity. So he moved to Vienna and spent the rest of his life as a hugely celebrated composer. So he really, even though he worked as a servant for 30 years, he developed this fame and this reputation and an enormous amount of wealth for a composer, and died a very rich man and a very respected man. He was very prolific, wrote 68 string quartets, 104 symphonies. His music is generally kind of light in mood. It's very classical in nature. It's easy to sing. He loved folk music, and he would use some of those folk melodies in his writing and would write melodies that were singable like a folk tune were. And that's one of the reasons his music was so popular. He talked about how he tried to see the humor in all of his life. He was known for being a very kind and generous man, and his music was very lighthearted and very kind of heartwarming and happy for the most part. Some of it was pretty intense, but for the most part, he had that just kind of laid back style to him, and that was one of the things that really made him so popular. And made him a really great teacher. I think his humble beginnings probably played into that a lot, of why he was such a great guy and just such a super nice man. So yeah, 68 string quartets, which are extremely important, and the 104 symphonies are really what set the groundwork for all composers of symphonies to come after that. And the last 12 of those are what we call the London symphonies. And those symphonies are especially celebrated. So some really great stuff. He wrote 2 major oratorios as well, the Creation in 1798 and the Seasons in 1801, just shortly before his death. Those are still very popular, but it's mostly his instrumental music that are performed today and widely celebrated today. And in 1796, he wrote a trumpet concerto, which was really weird. One of the first composers to write a piece featuring the trumpet. And this trumpet concerto was originally written for what's called the keyed trumpet, which was a first attempt to add keys to a brass instrument, to a trumpet. You know, that we talked about the natural trumpet and the problems you had with it. So people were trying to come up with a better solution. And the keyed trumpet took the key ideas from a woodwind instrument and applied them to a trumpet. So if you can think of the keys like you have on a clarinet, and adding that to a trumpet where it's just holes that have a pad over the top of them. And it kind of worked, but it was really a disaster of an instrument. There were only a few people that were able to really get a hold of it. It was very difficult to play, had a lot of intonation problems, and was eventually kind of forgotten as an instrument. And unfortunately, that trumpet concerto, which was written for that instrument, while it was performed a couple of times, because that instrument failed so miserably, nobody really thought about that concerto again until the early part of the 20th century. Around 1929, somebody broke it out and realized that you could play it on a modern trumpet, and it actually sounds really great. It's a really good trumpet concerto, and now it's one of the most popular trumpet concertos out there. There's some really great videos of trumpet players performing those. So again, it's as a concerto normally is. The orchestra is fairly subdued. They don't do a lot of stuff, but the trumpet player is really the one that's featured here. Now, we're going to listen to this piece, and this is going to be the example of Joseph Haydn's music that we're going to listen to kind of close us off today. But I want to talk about this trumpet player, Wynton Marsalis. So you may have heard Wynton Marsalis's name before. Hopefully you have. He deserves it. Wynton Marsalis is a hugely famous trumpet player, probably the most famous trumpet player in the world right now. He's mostly known for being a jazz trumpet player. He runs the Jazz at Lincoln Center Orchestra in New York City. He was, if you remember the Ken Burns jazz documentary that came out a couple of decades ago now, he was a major contributor to that. He's featured in it all the time. If you've ever seen a clip from Ken Burns Jazz, it probably featured Wynton Marsalis. He's originally from New Orleans. His family is a musical family. His brother Branford, his dad Ellis. So very, very famous and well-known jazz trumpet player. But he actually got his start as a well-known classical trumpet player as well. And this is a fairly old video of him playing the third movement from Haydn's Trumpet Concerto, and it's just mind-boggling. Wynton Marsalis has some of the best trumpet tone I've ever heard. He's a great, great player and a super nice guy. I've met Wynton, and he's incredibly friendly. He's a great educator. He's really big on music education, especially jazz education, and supports schools and supports education programs to a very high degree. And I think he's really going to go down in history as one of the great musical geniuses of our time. So if you ever have a chance to see Wynton Marsalis live, if you ever go to New York, go to Jazz at Lincoln Center and just kind of marvel in the excellence that is that jazz ensemble and Wynton Marsalis. So this is Wynton playing the third movement from Haydn's Trumpet Concerto. must have clicked on a playlist. All right, so that is Haydn and some of the popular genres of the classical era. That's where I wanted to get to today. So if anybody have any questions before we take off? All right, I'll stick around for a few minutes if you need anything, and I'll try to get on there and get that assignment fixed so that you can go back and retake it. Otherwise, I will see you next week. Have a good weekend.